Karen Whitmore walked up to my Navy patrol boat and slapped a $500 violation sticker right onto federal military property. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Military people aren't special." I was standing there fresh off deployment, coffee still steaming in my hand, watching this HOA president with a clipboard and measuring tape treat a U.S. Navy patrol vessel like it was some abandoned junk RV. "This commercial vehicle has to go," she snapped. "Pay up by Friday or we tow it." Diesel hung in the cold morning air. Her cheap perfume tried and failed to cover it. What she didn't realize in that moment was that she hadn't just written a fine. She had just interfered with a federally registered military asset. And the phone call that happened 30 minutes later would turn her petty HOA power trip into a criminal investigation. What would you do if your HOA tried to bully the U.S. Navy? Let me back up and explain how we got to this beautiful disaster. My name's Jake Thornfield, Commander, U.S. Navy, 15 years of service, recently divorced, and honestly just trying to rebuild my life in what seemed like a normal neighborhood. Riverside Meadows, you know the type. Upper middle class development built around 2015, where the biggest drama is usually someone's sprinklers hitting their neighbor's car. I chose this place for one reason: waterfront access. My 25-foot patrol boat isn't just a vehicle, it's everything. My dad served in World War II, and when the Navy decommissioned this vessel, I bought it to honor his memory. After my marriage fell apart and my world turned upside down, working on this boat with my teenage daughter Emma every other weekend became the only thing keeping me grounded. The neighborhood seemed perfect: quiet streets, decent people, lake access, and a driveway big enough for the boat trailer. Bob Fletcher, a retired Marine, lived 3 doors down with his own boat setup. Maria Santos, a legal secretary, lived across the street with her 2 kids. Normal families living normal lives. Then Karen Whitmore bought the McMansion at the end of the cul-de-sac. Karen's what happens when someone with zero real authority gets handed a clipboard and suddenly thinks they're running the Pentagon. Former insurance claims investigator, which explains why she treats every conversation like you're trying to commit fraud. No kids, husband who's conveniently traveling for business 90% of the time, and apparently infinite free time to make everyone else miserable. See, our HOA was supposed to be simple. Keep your grass reasonable, don't blast music at midnight, maybe organize a block party once a year, basic neighbor stuff. But when the builder turned control over to residents 3 years ago, Karen saw her chance to finally be important. Since nobody else wanted the headache, she ran for president unopposed. Big mistake, neighborhood, huge mistake. Within 6 months, Karen had transformed a simple homeowners association into her personal dictatorship. She started carrying around an actual ruler to measure grass height, a ruler for grass. She timed people's garbage can placement to ensure compliance with the no earlier than sunset the night before rule. And the photographs, dear God, this woman documented violations like she was building a federal case. But here's what made Karen truly dangerous: selective enforcement. Bob Fletcher's boat trailer sits in his driveway year-round without a peep from Karen. The family at the corner with kids' toys scattered across their front lawn every day? Nothing. But cross Karen personally, question her authority, or God forbid point out her own violations, and suddenly she'd discover 17 infractions that require immediate attention. The smell of fresh-cut grass and lake water used to mean peace and quiet. Now, it just reminded me that Karen was probably lurking somewhere with her measuring tape, hunting for reasons to ruin someone's day. So when I pulled into my driveway that October morning, boat loaded up for some routine maintenance after deployment, I figured my biggest problem would be replacing the fuel pump, maybe dealing with some rust spots. Instead, I got Karen clicking across my concrete in designer heels at 7 in the morning, violation notice already filled out like she'd been planning this ambush for months. "Commercial vehicles aren't permitted in residential driveways," she announced without so much as a welcome home. Section 12C of the Community Covenants, $500 fine, 30-day removal requirement plus additional penalties for non-compliance. I stood there with my deployment bag still over my shoulder, coffee getting cold, watching this woman wave around legal papers like she was serving a federal warrant instead of hassling someone who'd just spent 6 months making sure she could sleep safely in her oversized house. That's the moment I realized Karen Whitmore had made the worst miscalculation of her self-appointed career. She looked at me and saw some random neighbor she could bully into submission. What she actually did was pick a fight with the United States Navy. And brother, that phone call 30 minutes later was going to be very educational for everyone involved. The phone call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to my old friend at Navy Legal Assistance. "Jake, what kind of trouble did you find this time?" Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lucy laughed when she heard my voice. I explained the situation while staring at Karen's orange violation sticker fluttering on my boat like some kind of surrender flag she didn't know she'd already raised. The morning sun was warming up, and I could smell coffee brewing from someone's kitchen window. "Sarah, this HOA president is trying to fine federal military property. She wants me to remove a Navy vessel from my own driveway." The silence stretched for about 5 seconds. Then, "She did what?" 2 hours later, I had official documentation flooding my inbox. Back in law school, I'd learned about federal preemption, how federal law automatically trumps state and local regulations when they conflict. It's not a suggestion or a guideline, it's constitutional bedrock. But I never thought I'd need it to protect my boat from a suburban dictator with a measuring tape. Here's what I didn't expect. Karen doubled down. She showed up at my door that afternoon with 3 more violation notices, her heels clicking on my porch like a countdown timer. The sound was getting on my nerves. Apparently, my boat now also violated noise ordinances, property value standards, and something called aesthetic community guidelines. "I don't care what your military friends say," she announced, standing there like she owned my front porch. "Federal law doesn't override our community standards. This is a private neighborhood, not a military base." The woman actually said that, with complete confidence, like she'd just discovered some legal loophole that had escaped constitutional scholars for 2 centuries. The smell of her desperation was starting to overpower even that aggressive perfume. She'd spent the morning going door to door with a petition to ban commercial and military vehicles from our streets, working herself into a frenzy. 17 families signed this, she declared, waving her clipboard like evidence in a murder trial. "The community has spoken against military vehicles disrupting our peaceful neighborhood." I glanced at the signatures. Half were from addresses that didn't exist in our development. She'd apparently gotten creative with house numbers. The rest looked like people she'd cornered while they were rushing to work, probably signing just to escape her morning ambush. That's when Bob Fletcher walked over, drawn by the commotion. He took one look at Karen's petition and started laughing, the kind of deep, rumbling laugh that means someone's about to get educated in ways they won't enjoy. "Karen, you just asked me to sign a petition banning my own boat, the one sitting in my driveway for 3 years without a single word from you." Her face went crimson. That's completely different. Your boat isn't causing security issues like military property does." "Security issues?" Bob's voice carried that steel edge every Marine develops when dealing with weapons-grade stupidity. "Lady, this man spent 6 months overseas defending your right to stand here acting like an idiot. Show some respect." Wrong thing to say to Karen. She cranked the crazy up to 11. "Military people get special treatment for everything," she snapped, her voice rising to carry across the entire cul-de-sac. "Free health care, housing benefits, education benefits, and now they think community rules don't apply. Some of us actually work for a living instead of playing with boats on the taxpayer's dime." The sound of Bob Fletcher's jaw clenching was audible from 15 feet away. Maria Santos appeared from across the street, probably sensing the legal disaster about to unfold like a storm front moving in. "Karen," Maria said carefully, her legal secretary training kicking in, "you really should research federal housing protections before you continue down this path." "I've researched everything," Karen cut her off, waving those violation notices like battle flags. "HOA covenants are binding legal contracts. Military status doesn't give anyone special rights to violate private property agreements." That's when it hit me. Karen had never actually read the original covenant documents. She was working off summary sheets from the previous board, and something told me those summaries were missing crucial details, maybe deliberately. I pulled out my phone, showed her the Navy legal documentation. "Ma'am, this explains exactly why your violation notice is legally invalid. Want me to walk you through the federal statutes involved?" She barely glanced at the screen. "I don't read military propaganda. Pay the fine by Friday or we tow your boat. End of discussion." 3 neighbors stood there in the afternoon sun, watching Karen declare war on the U.S. Constitution. Someone's barbecue smoke drifted over from the next street, normal people having normal weekend afternoons while our HOA president was busy committing career suicide. That evening, another certified letter arrived. Karen had escalated from simple violation to threatening seizure of federal property. She still had absolutely no clue what she'd just unleashed. Karen's next move proved she'd completely lost whatever grip on reality she'd started with. Monday morning, I woke up to find city code enforcement in my driveway. A tired-looking inspector named Rodriguez was walking around my boat with a clipboard, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he'd been called out for this. "You Commander Thornfield?" he asked, already sounding apologetic. "That's right. I'm guessing Karen Whitmore sent you?" He sighed. "She filed a complaint claiming you've got an abandoned commercial vehicle violating city ordinances. Said it's been here for months without registration." He glanced at the giant U.S. Navy painted across the hull. "Sir, I've got to ask, is she serious?" I handed him the federal documentation. Rodriguez took one look, pulled out his phone, and made a call that ended Karen's code enforcement career before it started. "Ma'am, this is Inspector Rodriguez. That complaint you filed? The vehicle in question is federal military property with proper registration. No, I cannot issue a violation. Because it's the U.S. Navy, ma'am. Yes, I'm sure." The sound of him hanging up echoed across the driveway. "Commander, I apologize for wasting your time. That woman's been calling our office twice a day for a week." But Karen wasn't done. She'd also contacted our homeowner's insurance company. That afternoon, I got a call from my agent. "Jake, I've got some lady claiming your boat is a safety hazard affecting the entire neighborhood's coverage. She says you're storing hazardous materials and military weapons." I laughed. "Military weapons? It's a patrol boat, not a destroyer. The most dangerous thing on board is probably expired flare guns." "Yeah, I figured, but she's demanding we drop your coverage or raise everyone's premiums. She's also threatening to sue the insurance company for enabling dangerous military activities in civilian areas." Here's something I learned during my divorce proceedings. Insurance fraud is a federal crime when it crosses state lines. Karen had just graduated from annoying neighbor to potential felon, and she didn't even know it. That evening, Karen organized what she called an emergency community safety meeting. She'd sent flyers to every house, complete with photos of my boat and dramatic headlines about military vehicle invasion and neighborhood security crisis. The meeting was held in the community center, a fancy name for the glorified shed where we kept pool maintenance equipment. Karen had arranged folding chairs like she was hosting a town hall, complete with a podium she'd borrowed from somewhere. About 15 neighbors showed up, mostly out of curiosity. Karen stood at the front in a business suit, looking like she was about to deliver a State of the Union address. "Thank you all for coming to address this serious threat to our community safety," she began, pointing at blown-up photos of my boat. "Military vehicles have no place in residential neighborhoods. They attract the wrong element, decrease property values, and pose unknown security risks." Bob Fletcher raised his hand. "Karen, what exactly do you think is going to happen? Is the boat going to attack us?" "This isn't a joke, Robert," she snapped. "Military personnel are trained killers. Having weapons of war parked in driveways sends a message that our neighborhood accepts violence." The room went dead silent. Maria Santos stood up, her legal training clearly kicking in. "Karen, you're accusing a decorated Navy officer of being a threat to community safety because of his military service. That's discrimination, and it's illegal." "I'm protecting property values," Karen shot back. "Military families bring instability, deployments, PTSD, weapons training. These people are different from normal families." Wrong thing to say in front of Bob Fletcher's wife, Carmen, who'd been quietly knitting in the back row. "Normal families?" Carmen's voice cut through the room like a blade. "My husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Are you saying we don't belong in this neighborhood?" The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Several neighbors started shifting uncomfortably, realizing Karen had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Karen kept digging. "I'm saying military families should live on military bases where their lifestyle choices don't affect civilian property values. This neighborhood was supposed to be peaceful." That's when I noticed something interesting. Karen kept mentioning property values, but she'd been asking very specific questions about my house's purchase price and mortgage details, almost like she had a financial interest in forcing me to sell. Young couple from the end of the street, the Hendersons, stood up to leave. "This is insane," Mrs. Henderson said. "We moved here because it seemed like a nice community. This isn't nice at all." They weren't the only ones. Half the room emptied while Karen was still talking about military invasion, and protecting our children from violence exposure. By the time she finished her presentation, she was basically talking to herself and two neighbors who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. That night, I got 3 separate calls from neighbors apologizing for Karen's behavior. Apparently, word was spreading that our HOA president had officially lost her mind. But Karen's biggest mistake was still coming. Karen's media campaign backfired so spectacularly that it probably set some kind of record for self-inflicted damage. She'd contacted the local newspaper, spinning a story about military intimidation and federal overreach in suburban neighborhoods. The reporter who showed up, Jessica Martinez, had done her homework. "Ms. Whitmore, can you explain why other boats in the neighborhood haven't received similar violations?" I watched from my front window as Karen fumbled for an answer. She was standing next to my boat, gesturing dramatically while Jessica took photos. "Those are recreational vehicles," Karen finally said. "This is military property, which poses different concerns for family safety." "What specific safety concerns?" Jessica pressed. "The boat appears to be decommissioned civilian patrol craft. Military personnel are trained for combat situations. Having weapons of war in civilian areas creates an atmosphere of violence that affects children's development." Jessica stopped writing and looked up from her notepad. "Are you suggesting military families shouldn't live in civilian neighborhoods?" "I'm suggesting they should live where their lifestyle choices don't impact normal families' property investments." The interview went downhill from there. Jessica spent another hour talking to neighbors, including Bob Fletcher, who gave her an earful about Karen's selective enforcement and discrimination against veterans. When the story ran 3 days later, the headline read, "Local HOA President Under Fire for Anti-Military Discrimination." The article included quotes from Karen calling military families unstable and suggesting they don't belong in peaceful neighborhoods. The backlash was swift and brutal. By noon, Karen's phone was ringing constantly. Veterans organizations, military family support groups, and half the city council were demanding explanations. The mayor's office issued a statement supporting military families' housing rights. Social media exploded. Someone had posted Karen's quotes alongside photos of local veterans, including a Gold Star mother whose son had died in Iraq. The hashtag Riverside Shame was trending locally by evening. But Karen's response to negative publicity proved she'd learned nothing from the experience. She doubled down with a vengeance. First, she hired a private security company to patrol our neighborhood, claiming increased security concerns due to military presence. 2 bored-looking guards in a white sedan started making hourly drives past my house, like I was running some kind of terrorist cell out of my garage. Then she attempted to block my access to the community boat launch. I discovered this when I tried to take Emma out for our weekly father-daughter boat trip. Karen was standing at the launch ramp with orange cones and a clipboard, looking like she was directing traffic at a disaster scene. "Private property," she announced when I approached with the boat trailer. "Homeowners only." "Karen, I live here. This is my daughter Emma." "Military vehicles aren't permitted at community facilities," she declared, completely ignoring Emma, who was staring at this woman like she'd grown a second head. "It's the same boat that's been using this launch for 2 years," I pointed out. "Previous usage doesn't establish permanent rights. New security protocols require background checks for all watercraft operators." Emma, who's 16 and doesn't suffer fools gladly, piped up, "Lady, are you seriously trying to background check the Navy?" Karen's face went red. "Young lady, this is adult business. Military families need to understand that community resources have restrictions." That's when I realized Karen had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd decided to mess with my daughter. The smell of lake water and boat exhaust was mixing with Karen's increasingly frantic perfume as more neighbors started gathering to watch this disaster unfold. The Hendersons were setting up their own boat launch, completely ignoring Karen's cones. Bob Fletcher was launching his kayak with deliberate slowness, clearly enjoying the show. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "you're blocking a public waterway access point that's maintained by the city, not the HOA. Community facilities are governed by community standards," she insisted. Maria Santos appeared with her kids and their fishing gear. As a legal secretary, she'd obviously done her research. "Karen, the boat launch easement is public property. The city maintains it, and the HOA has no authority to restrict access. You're actually violating municipal access rights." But Karen had moved beyond caring about legal details. "Military families are disrupting community peace. Other residents have expressed concerns about weapons training and combat-related activities." "Combat-related activities?" I couldn't help laughing. We're going fishing. Military personnel are always training for violence, she declared to the growing crowd of neighbors. Children shouldn't be exposed to this kind of aggressive behavior. That's when Bob Fletcher started slow clapping from his kayak. Karen, you've officially become the neighborhood crazy person. Congratulations. The sound of his applause echoed across the water as other neighbors joined in. Karen stood there with her cones and clipboard, suddenly realizing she was the only one who thought any of this made sense. But her biggest mistake was still ahead. Because that evening, she made the phone call that would turn her HOA presidency into a criminal case. She called the FBI to report suspicious military activity in our neighborhood. The FBI call was Karen's masterpiece of self-destruction. Agent Patricia Wells showed up at my door Friday morning, looking exactly like someone who'd been dragged away from real work to deal with a suburban lunatic. Commander Thornfield, I'm Special Agent Wells, FBI. We received a report of suspicious military activity at this address. I invited her in for coffee. Agent Wells, let me guess, Karen Whitmore called you. She smiled. How did you know? Because she's been escalating her attacks on my family for 2 weeks. What exactly did she report? Agent Wells pulled out her notepad. Quote, military personnel conducting weapons training and strategic planning in residential area. Possible terrorist cell using boat for transportation of illegal materials. Request immediate investigation of federal security threat. I nearly choked on my coffee. She reported me as a terrorist for parking my boat in my own driveway. It gets better, Wells continued. She also claimed you were recruiting other veterans for anti-government activities and running unauthorized military operations out of your garage. The absurdity was almost beautiful. Karen had called the FBI to investigate a Navy officer for being in the Navy. Agent Wells spent 20 minutes examining my boat, reviewing my service record, and confirming what anyone with functioning brain cells already knew. I was exactly who I claimed to be, doing exactly nothing suspicious. Commander, I have to ask, what did you do to make this woman so angry? I came home from deployment. She laughed. Well, Ms. Whitmore has now filed a false report with federal law enforcement. That's a felony. She's also interfered with a federal investigation by providing knowingly false information. But here's where things got really interesting. While Agent Wells was investigating Karen's ridiculous claims, she noticed something else: the financial irregularities in HOA management that Maria Santos had been quietly documenting. See, Maria wasn't just a legal secretary. She was a forensic legal secretary who specialized in financial fraud cases, and she'd been paying attention to Karen's vendor contracts and expense reports. Commander, your neighbor, Ms. Santos, asked me to look at some HOA documents while I'm here. Says there might be additional federal crimes involved. Maria appeared with a banker's box full of records. Agent Wells, I think Karen's HOA position is a cover for embezzlement and contractor fraud. The numbers were staggering. Karen had approved $180,000 in maintenance contracts over 3 years. Legitimate bids for the same work? About $75,000. The difference was going to shell companies that traced back to accounts Karen controlled. But here's the federal angle. Karen had been using the Postal Service to mail fraudulent invoices and fake vendor documentation. Mail fraud carries the same penalties as bank robbery. She's been systematically stealing from the HOA, Maria explained, spreading out bank statements and invoices. Inflated contracts, kickback schemes, and forged board approvals. She's probably taken over $100,000. Agent Wells was taking detailed notes. How long has this been going on? Since she became president. But it escalated after Commander Thornfield moved in. She needed a distraction from the financial irregularities, so she created this military threat narrative. That's when the full picture became clear. Karen's attack on my boat wasn't about HOA rules or property values. It was about covering up federal crimes. She'd been embezzling from the community for 3 years. When neighbors started asking questions about rising fees and declining services, she needed a crisis to distract attention. My boat became her perfect scapegoat. The smell of Karen's desperation finally made sense. She wasn't just power-hungry. She was a cornered criminal trying to avoid prison. Agent Wells gathered all the financial evidence in my documentation of Karen's harassment campaign. Commander, this woman has committed multiple federal felonies: false reporting, mail fraud, embezzlement from a homeowners association, and civil rights violations. What happens now? Now she gets arrested. But we need to coordinate with local authorities because she's also violated state laws. Fraud, theft, filing false police reports, and probably a few others. I watched through my window as Agent Wells walked over to Karen's house. The conversation at her front door lasted about 5 minutes before Karen started screaming about military conspiracies and federal harassment of honest citizens. By evening, Karen had received official notice that she was under federal investigation for multiple felonies. Her HOA presidency was automatically suspended pending criminal proceedings. The neighborhood group chat was buzzing with news that our dictatorial president was actually a common thief who'd been stealing from us for years. But Karen's response to federal criminal charges would prove she'd learned absolutely nothing from this experience. She was about to make the worst decisions of her already disastrous life. Time for strategic warfare. Agent Wells had given me the federal prosecutor's contact information, and by Monday morning, I was coordinating with attorneys who specialized in civil rights violations and financial crimes. Turns out, Karen had stumbled into a perfect storm of federal jurisdiction. The Service Members Civil Relief Act protects military families from exactly the kind of harassment Karen had been dishing out. Violations carry automatic attorney fee awards, meaning she'd pay for my legal costs, win or lose. But that was just the beginning. Here's something most people don't know about HOA embezzlement. When it involves federal mail fraud, it triggers RICO statutes. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Karen's 3-year theft scheme qualified as organized crime under federal law. Bob Fletcher and I spent Tuesday evening in my garage, going through 3 years of HOA meeting minutes that Maria had obtained from county records. Karen had been forging board votes for major expenditures, approving contracts that never went through proper bidding, and creating entire maintenance projects that existed only on paper. Look at this. Bob pointed to a $15,000 emergency roof repair for the community center. That roof was replaced 6 months ago for $4,000. Where'd the other 11 grand go? Emma was handling the social media warfare. At 16, she understood platforms I'd never heard of, and Karen's anti-military quotes were going viral in ways that would make a marketing professional weep with envy. Dad, hashtag Karen V's Navy has 40,000 shares on TikTok, she reported, looking up from her laptop. Military families all over the country are posting their own HOA horror stories. The Veterans Coalition of Riverside Meadows was now 15 families strong, all documenting Karen's selective enforcement and discriminatory behavior. We had photos, videos, recorded conversations, and enough evidence to fill a small courthouse. Maria Santos had become our unofficial legal coordinator, using her forensic training to organize evidence in ways prosecutors dream about. She'd created timelines, financial flowcharts, and documentation that would make the FBI's case practically airtight. Karen's biggest mistake was putting everything in writing, Maria explained, showing us email threads where Karen explicitly discussed targeting military families. She documented her own civil rights violations. Wednesday brought the community education campaign. I hosted Know Your Rights seminars for military families, teaching them about federal housing protections and HOA governance requirements. Turns out, Karen had been violating veterans' rights for years, but nobody knew enough law to challenge her. Here's what civilian families don't understand about military housing rights. The Service Members Civil Relief Act isn't just about deployment protection. It covers discrimination, harassment, and retaliation against military families. Karen had violated federal law so many times we needed spreadsheets to track it all. The forensic accountant Maria had recommended found additional irregularities that even surprised us. Karen had been billing the HOA for personal expenses, her home security system, landscaping for her own property, even her car payments. She'd claimed everything was community security or presidential duties. Total theft over 3 years, $127,000. Not exactly Bernie Madoff territory, but enough to trigger serious federal penalties. Thursday brought tactical planning for the final confrontation. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening, with media invited to document Karen's official removal from office. Agent Wells advised us to let Karen continue making public statements. Every time she opens her mouth, she provides more evidence for federal prosecutors. The woman can't stop incriminating herself. The local VFW commander offered organizational support and media contacts. Military Times wanted to interview me about HOA discrimination. The American Legion was preparing a statement about veterans' housing rights, but our secret weapon was timing. Karen didn't know about the federal investigation's full scope. She thought this was still about boat parking violations, not realizing she was facing multiple felony charges. Friday evening, I reviewed our complete evidence package: financial fraud documentation, civil rights violation recordings, false federal report documentation, and testimony from 15 families about Karen's abuse of authority. The smell of victory was mixing with autumn air as neighbors prepared for Saturday's showdown. Karen had spent 3 years terrorizing this community, stealing our money, and attacking military families. Tomorrow, she'd face the consequences of every choice she'd made. The best part? She still thought she was going to win. Karen's response to federal criminal charges was to hire the most expensive lawyer in 3 counties and declare total war on everyone who'd opposed her. Her attorney, Richard Pemberton, looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone charging $800 an hour. Expensive suit, perfect hair, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having met a problem money couldn't solve. Their first move was threatening defamation lawsuits against every neighbor who'd spoken to the media about Karen's behavior. Cease and desist letters arrived via certified mail, demanding retractions and monetary damages for malicious falsehoods about Karen's character. Bob Fletcher's response was to frame his letter and hang it in his garage like a trophy. But Karen's legal strategy went beyond intimidation. She started spreading rumors that made her previous accusations look reasonable by comparison. She told anyone who'd listen that my boat contained classified military equipment and that I was conducting surveillance operations on the neighborhood. She claimed my garage workshop was actually a weapons modification facility and that federal agents were protecting me because I was an undercover operative. The paranoia was becoming genuinely concerning. Maria Santos got the worst of it. Karen had somehow discovered that Maria handled fraud investigations for her law firm and decided this made her part of a federal conspiracy against honest HOA presidents. "She's telling people I'm an FBI informant," Maria told me while we organized evidence files in my kitchen. "She's also claiming I'm being paid by the military to spy on civilian communities." Karen's husband, David, had returned from his business trip to find federal agents interviewing his wife about embezzlement charges. His response was to immediately hire his own attorney and file for divorce, claiming he'd had no knowledge of Karen's financial activities. This sent Karen into a spiral that was visible from space. She started appearing at neighbors' doors at all hours, demanding they sign affidavits supporting her version of events. She offered Emma's babysitting clients cash to report suspicious activities at our house. She even approached the mail carrier trying to get him to confirm that I received unusual packages that might contain military contraband. Then came the bribery attempt. Saturday morning, Karen showed up at my door with a cashier's check for $10,000 and a prepared statement claiming the boat incident had been a misunderstanding between neighbors. "Take the money and tell the FBI this was all blown out of proportion," she said, standing on my porch like she was offering to buy a used car. "We can make this whole thing disappear." I was recording this conversation on my phone per my attorney's advice. "Karen, are you trying to bribe me to lie to federal investigators?" "It's not a bribe. It's a settlement for the inconvenience you've experienced. Plus, I'll guarantee no future HOA issues with your boat." "And in exchange?" "You call Agent Wells and tell her you exaggerated about the harassment. Say it was a simple neighbor dispute that got out of hand." The woman was literally offering money to obstruct a federal investigation on my front porch while I recorded every word. "Karen, you're asking me to lie to the FBI. I'm asking you to be reasonable. Military people understand strategic thinking, right? Sometimes you have to compromise to achieve larger objectives." The conversation lasted 12 minutes and provided enough evidence for additional federal charges. Karen had just graduated from embezzlement and false reporting to attempted bribery and obstruction of justice. But her crowning achievement in self-destruction was still coming. That afternoon, she organized what she called a community protection rally in the neighborhood park. She'd invited local news cameras and set up a podium like she was running for office. About 30 people showed up, mostly to watch the spectacle. Karen stood at the microphone in a business suit, looking like she was about to announce her candidacy for president. "Citizens of Riverside Meadows," she began, "we're under attack by federal forces using military families as cover for surveillance operations." Bob Fletcher started laughing so hard he nearly fell off the picnic table. "Laugh if you want," Karen continued, "but ask yourselves why the FBI showed up immediately when I questioned one military vehicle. Ask why federal agents are protecting someone who refuses to follow community rules. She went on for 20 minutes about government overreach, military conspiracies, and federal plots against honest homeowners. Local news broadcasted the whole thing live, providing Karen with enough rope to hang herself professionally, legally, and socially. The smell of her desperation was now mixed with complete delusion as she accused half the neighborhood of being federal informants. By evening, Karen's rally was trending on social media as an example of HOA presidents losing their minds. The video had been viewed 200,000 times, with comments ranging from hilarious to deeply concerned about Karen's mental state. But her final desperate act was still coming. Karen's last desperate gambit was vandalism. Tuesday night, my security cameras caught her sneaking across my driveway at 2 a.m. with what looked like a bottle of automotive paint stripper. She poured it along the side of my boat, apparently thinking she could damage it enough to justify her safety concerns. The acrid chemical smell woke me up around 3. I found streaks of acid burns along the hull, eating through the navy paint like some kind of corrosive nightmare. But here's what Karen didn't understand about security cameras. They record everything, including her license plate, her face, and the Home Depot receipt she'd thrown in my garbage can. Agent Wells arrived that morning with a crime scene photographer and enough evidence collection bags to process a murder. Commander, she just escalated from financial crimes to destruction of federal property. That's a felony enhancement. The paint stripper had caused about $3,000 in damage, but the federal angle made it serious. Vandalism of military property carries enhanced penalties, especially when it's part of an ongoing harassment campaign. Karen's response to being caught was to claim the boat had spontaneously deteriorated due to improper storage of hazardous military chemicals. She actually called the fire department to report a chemical leak from my garage. Fire Chief Martinez showed up with a hazmat team, looking like he'd rather be fighting actual fires than dealing with suburban psychosis. After finding nothing more dangerous than lawnmower fuel and boat maintenance supplies, he had some choice words for Karen about false emergency reports. "Ma'am, calling in fake hazmat situations wastes resources that could be needed for real emergencies. That's a misdemeanor charge and I'm filing it personally." But Karen's master plan was just getting started. She filed an insurance claim against the HOA policy, claiming my boat had leaked toxic substances that required professional cleanup of community property. The insurance investigator took one look at her claim and opened a fraud investigation. Then she attempted to have my boat towed as an abandoned vehicle. I discovered this when I came home Thursday to find a tow truck in my driveway and a very confused driver trying to figure out how to hook up a boat trailer. "Sir, I got a call about an abandoned military vehicle," he explained, looking at the paperwork Karen had given him. "But this doesn't look abandoned, and I don't think I'm qualified to tow Navy property." Karen was standing on her porch, watching through binoculars like she was directing a military operation. "Smart thinking," I told the driver. "Towing federal property without authorization is a federal crime. You probably saved yourself a lot of trouble." He left immediately, but not before giving Karen a piece of his mind about wasting his time with fake towing requests. Friday brought Karen's final meltdown. She started knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, demanding neighbors sign a petition to expel military families from Riverside Meadows. Most people slammed their doors, but a few were polite enough to listen to her increasingly unhinged theories. "Military personnel are trained killers," she told Mrs. Henderson while her kids played in the yard. "Having them in civilian neighborhoods creates psychological trauma for children who aren't used to violence." Mrs. Henderson asked her to leave. "Combat veterans suffer from PTSD and substance abuse," she told the young couple at the end of the street. "Property values plummet when military families move in because banks know the risks." They called the police, but Karen's piece de resistance was calling Child Protective Services. She reported me for exposing a minor to dangerous military equipment and using a child to transport weapons across state lines. She claimed Emma was being militarized through boat trips and that I was training her for combat scenarios. The CPS investigator who showed up seemed genuinely embarrassed about the whole thing. "Mr. Thornfield, someone reported that you're, and I'm reading this directly, indoctrinating your daughter into military violence culture through boat-based combat training exercises." Emma, who was doing homework at the kitchen table, looked up and said, "She means fishing. We go fishing." The investigation lasted about 10 minutes and resulted in CPS filing a complaint against Karen for false reporting involving child welfare. By weekend, Karen had racked up charges for vandalism, false emergency reports, insurance fraud, filing false CPS reports, and attempted obstruction of justice. But the community had reached its breaking point. Saturday's emergency HOA meeting was packed beyond capacity. Media crews, federal agents, and neighbors who'd had enough of Karen's reign of terror were all gathering for what everyone knew would be the final confrontation. The smell of justice was finally in the air. Saturday evening, 6 p.m. The community center was packed like a concert venue. Every folding chair was occupied. Neighbors were standing along the walls, and local news crews had set up cameras to broadcast Karen's political execution live. Agent Wells sat in the back row with federal prosecutors, armed with enough criminal evidence to lock Karen up for years. Karen arrived 15 minutes late wearing her best business suit and carrying a banker's box of evidence, like she was about to deliver a closing argument that would vindicate her completely. She had no idea she was walking into her own funeral. "Thank you for coming to this critical community meeting," she began, positioning herself behind the podium like she was still in charge of something. "Tonight, we address the military invasion of our peaceful neighborhood and the federal harassment of honest citizens." Bob Fletcher raised his hand. "Karen, are you seriously still talking?" She ignored him. "For weeks, I've been subjected to persecution for enforcing community standards. Federal agents have been called in to intimidate a citizen who dared to question military privilege." Maria Santos stood up with a stack of financial documents. "Karen, before you continue embarrassing yourself, would you like to explain where $127,000 in HOA funds went over the past 3 years? The room went dead silent. Karen's face shifted through several colors before settling on pale green. Those are routine operational expenses that civilian neighbors don't understand. Operational expenses like your car payments? Maria pressed. Your home security system? Your personal landscaping bills? Karen's attorney, Pemberton, was furiously scribbling notes and looking like he wanted to crawl under his chair. Community security requires comprehensive protection, Karen insisted. As president, my personal safety ensures continuity of governance. That's when Agent Wells stood up. Ms. Whitmore, I'm Special Agent Wells, FBI. You're under arrest for mail fraud, embezzlement, filing false federal reports, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed through the dead silent room. You have the right to remain silent, Wells continued as Karen's face went from green to ash white. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court. Karen tried one last desperate play. This is federal harassment. I'm being persecuted for protecting civilian families from military intimidation. Ma'am, you called the FBI to report a Navy officer as a terrorist for parking his boat in his own driveway, Wells replied. Then you vandalized federal property, attempted to bribe a witness, and stole over $100,000 from your neighbors. The room erupted in applause as Wells escorted Karen toward the exit in handcuffs. Her expensive attorney was gathering his papers and looking like he needed a very strong drink. But Karen couldn't resist one final statement. Military people think they're above the law, she screamed as Wells guided her through the doorway. This neighborhood will never be safe with trained killers living among normal families. Her voice echoed across the parking lot as neighbors stood in the doorway, watching 3 years of tyranny finally come to an end. The local news anchor was broadcasting live, a dramatic conclusion tonight in Riverside Meadows, where an HOA president who targeted military families has been arrested on federal charges. Bob Fletcher started slow clapping again, and this time the entire room joined in. The applause lasted for nearly 2 minutes as neighbors celebrated the end of Karen's reign of terror. Emergency motion to dissolve the current HOA board and elect new leadership, called out Mrs. Henderson. Seconded, shouted about 15 voices simultaneously. The vote was unanimous, 47 in favor, 0 opposed, 1 abstention from Pemberton, who was probably calculating his legal bills. But the real victory speech came from 8-year-old Tommy Santos, Maria's youngest son, who raised his hand and asked, "Does this mean the crazy lady won't yell at us anymore?" The laughter that followed could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Emma was live streaming the whole thing for her TikTok followers, providing running commentary about HOA Karens getting arrested for messing with military families. Karen vs. Navy was trending nationally within an hour. As neighbors filed out into the evening air, there was a feeling I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The smell of autumn leaves and lake water wasn't tainted with Karen's perfume and desperation anymore. Maria Santos approached me with a group of neighbors. "Jake, we'd like you to consider running for HOA president, someone who actually understands service and community." Agent Wells handed me her card as she left. "Commander, your case is going to be cited in civil rights training for years. Thank you for documenting everything so thoroughly." Karen Whitmore had finally learned what happens when you pick a fight with the United States Navy. She just learned it from the backseat of an FBI vehicle. 6 months later, Karen Whitmore was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. The judge wasn't gentle. "Ms. Whitmore, you systematically stole from your community, filed false reports with federal agencies, and engaged in civil rights violations targeting military families. Your behavior represents everything wrong with unchecked authority." She got 18 months for the financial crimes, plus 3 years probation for the civil rights violations. The restitution order required her to pay back $127,000 to the HOA, plus my legal fees, which totaled another $45,000. Her ex-husband David had moved to Florida before the sentencing. The divorce settlement gave him everything except Karen's legal debts, which she'd be paying off for approximately the rest of her natural life. But the real victory wasn't Karen's imprisonment, it was what happened to our community. The new HOA board, led by Bob Fletcher as president and Maria Santos as treasurer, implemented reforms that became a model for military-friendly communities nationwide. We established term limits, mandatory financial audits, and explicit protections for military families. My boat, now permanently displayed in the driveway with a small plaque reading U.S. Navy, protected by federal law, had become something of a neighborhood landmark. Families brought their kids by to learn about military service and veterans' rights. Emma started the Riverside Veterans Education Foundation with her college fund contribution and money from Karen's restitution payments. The foundation awards $5,000 annually to military children pursuing higher education. Emma was the first recipient, heading to Georgetown in the fall to study constitutional law. "Dad, I want to be a military rights attorney," she told me while we worked on the boat one Saturday morning. Karen taught me that someone needs to protect military families from people like her. The annual Riverside Freedom Festival became our community's biggest event. Military families from across the region attend to celebrate service and educate civilians about veterans' rights. My boat serves as a floating stage for guest speakers, including federal judges who cite our case in military housing discrimination rulings. The smell of barbecue smoke and lake water now carries sounds of children playing and families laughing instead of Karen's heels clicking on concrete with violation notices. Maria Santos and I started dating 6 months ago. Turns out, fighting federal crimes together is a pretty solid foundation for a relationship. She moved into my guest house last month, bringing her kids and creating the kind of blended family that actually works. My mother, who'd been living in assisted care, moved into the renovated guest apartment. Having her close by for Emma's senior year, watching 3 generations work together on the boat, feels like everything I was fighting for finally came together. Bob Fletcher was re-elected HOA president unanimously. His first official act was establishing the Karen Whitmore Memorial Stupid Rule, which automatically voids any HOA regulation that discriminates against military families. The legal precedent from our case led to federal legislation strengthening military housing protections. The Thornfield protocols are now mandatory training for HOA management companies, and Karen's arrest video is used in civil rights seminars across the country. Karen's house sold to a young Air Force family at below market price. Staff Sergeant Williams and his wife Jessica have 2 kids and a dog, and they use their driveway for everything Karen would have hated: kids' bikes, a motorcycle, and occasional visits from Jessica's brother, who drives a very large Army truck. The irony is delicious. Last month I received a call from a Navy family in Texas facing similar HOA discrimination. Their president claimed authority over a veteran service dog, demanding emotional support animal fees for a working military animal. "Commander Thornfield, we heard about your case. Can you help us understand our rights?" Looks like Karen's legacy is inspiring a whole new generation of HOA tyrants who need education about federal law. The best part? Every time military families win these battles, they cite our case. Karen Whitmore's name is now permanently associated with spectacular legal failure and federal imprisonment. Justice has a sense of humor. So here's what I want you to do. Drop a comment below with your worst HOA nightmare story. I read every single one, and your experience might be featured in our next video about entitled neighbors who need to learn about federal law. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because these HOA revenge stories get crazier every week. Trust me, Karen wasn't the only petty dictator out there who needs to discover that military families have rights that supersede clipboard tyranny. And remember, document everything, know your rights, and never let petty tyrants win. Sometimes the best victory is watching someone destroy their own life through pure stupidity. Karen certainly proved that theory correct.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.